Hello everyone. Today we will listening a romantic audiobook.
All in the Past. A Second Chance Billionaire Romance. A book by Betsy Hayes. Lucy glared at the dirty dishes piled up haphazardly in the sink. She'd washed every pan, plate and bowl just this morning before she went to work, but her roommates had managed to use everything in the hours she'd been away. "Oh hey, Luce, you're back already?" Krista said as she came into the kitchen, carrying two dirty plates with a newspaper tucked under her arm. Her boyfriend was over so often that it felt like he lived there, and the two of them would eat in their room. Krista went over to the stack of dishes in the sink and looked at it dubiously for a few seconds before balancing her two plates on the very top of the pile. "Back already," Lucy said, glaring harder at the now larger pile. She wished that she could be more relaxed and easygoing about the housework.
She grew up watching her parents tidying up after other people, and she'd always told herself that she wouldn't suffer the same fate. Yet here she was, cleaning up after everyone else. Geez. Somebody should really tidy all this up, Krista sighed, shaking her head. "Well, Johnny and me are heading out now. You wanna come with us? We're going to Betsy's show." Betsy was another roommate. Right. Luce's feet ached from standing all day. She'd come to New York to be an artist, but she had to put in so many shifts at the coffee shop that it was hard to find the time and energy to paint. She'd been hoping to get more done on her most recent oil painting this evening. "That's tonight?" One night only. Lucy sat down, glad to be off her feet at last, and found herself eye level with Krista's newspaper. A word in the headline caught her eye. Graffin. She blinked, making sure she'd seen that right. There was a time when she'd see that name everywhere, misreading other words because Graffin meant so much to her. She wanted to see it, wanted to know everything that was going on. Those times were over, but the name stirred something dormant in her mind. Lucy sighed. There was no point going any deeper into that. It was so long ago. She was making her own life now, finding her own lonely path. "Give me 5 minutes to get changed?" Betsy's show was being held in a converted warehouse, the large attic filled with sculptures made by different students on Betsy's course. The ache in Luce's feet was getting worse as she made her way over to Betsy's section. Her roommate definitely had talent, and Lucy admired the work for a few minutes before looking over her shoulder at the crowd. There were far more people here than came to her exhibits. Lucy chewed her lips, feeling guilty that she was jealous when she should be glad for her friend. 3 more of Luce's roommates came over, and, after greeting each other, they all stood in silence for a few seconds. "You know, she's sold like half of these. I guess she's not going to be worrying about the rent for a while," Ben said, nudging Luce's shoulder. Lucy stepped back. Ben was tactile with everyone, but she'd never been comfortable with it. She hummed in agreement, thinking about the stack of unsold paintings in her room. They were all listed online, and her site got a few hits every few days. It would be better once she got an agent. She just needed to sell a few pieces and prove she was worth an agent's time. "She works so hard," Willa murmured. "I'm really happy for her. She totally deserves it after all the effort she's put in." Lucy stifled a flinch. The need to get back to the apartment and finish her painting gnawed at her. After congratulating Betsy, Lucy left, taking the subway home. The man sitting opposite her was reading a newspaper, holding it wide open in front of him so that Lucy couldn't avoid reading the headline. "Graffin CEO stepping down. Jacob Graffin takes complete control." Lucy lowered her eyes to her phone, ignoring the man and his newspaper. "You're always so busy. Are you eating enough?" Lucy snorted, amused at the cliché. "Yes, Dad. I'm eating enough." It had been almost a week since Betsy's show, and Lucy had thrown herself into her painting. She'd nearly finished this last piece. "Good. Mr. Graffin was talking the other day about Lucy gritted her teeth. She hated hearing about the old man. He dictated so much of her life, but she was free of that now and she wanted to forget about the Graffins. Yeah? What was the old man talking about? There are all sorts of changes being made. He's going to be moving out here permanently. It'll be wonderful, don't you think? It's a very exciting time because we're going to be hiring more staff. You know Mr. Graffin likes everything to be correct. I do indeed, Lucy said, trying not to sound bitter. She didn't want her dad to notice. As the family's butler, he prided himself on his loyalty to Mr. Graffin. Lucy didn't need another speech about how grateful she should be for all of Mr. and Mrs. Graffin's support over the years, even if they'd only paid for 1 year of her university despite promising to cover it completely. She'd turned out fine without their help. She'd had to drop out of college, at the time that felt like the end of the world. But it had forced her to think about what she really wanted to do in life. It was when she decided to pursue her passion and go to art school instead. So he's leaving the city? Lucy asked, injecting an interest into her voice that she didn't feel in the slightest. Yes, Mr. Graffin's arriving tomorrow. Jacob's taking over, of course. So I don't think we'll be seeing much of him. It'll be nice once we're settled into a routine. As much as she didn't want to hear about Mr. Graffin, she hated the sound of Jacob's name. She didn't blame her dad for saying it so carelessly. She didn't want him to know how the sound of it still twisted her up inside. Listen, Dad, I need to go. My shift starts in, oh, I understand. I'm so proud of you, following your dream like this. You're so much braver than I ever was. Lucy didn't feel brave, but she smiled as she spoke. Thanks, Dad. Love you. Bye. She ended the call without hearing him say goodbye. Krista's old newspaper had been left on the kitchen table, heavily wrinkled now. Lucy unfolded it and saw the picture of Jacob Graffin, his chin cocked up, hair slicked back. He didn't look so different than back when she knew him. There were some differences, a coldness in his eyes, mouth set in an unsmiling mask. She traced her finger across those stern lips and drew back with a laugh. It was completely melodramatic to make all those assumptions from one picture. He was probably just thinking about something serious when the photo was taken, like some business deal, or what he wanted for dinner. Jacob, she remembered with a pang, used to take dinner plans very seriously. But then, it had been so long ago, she doubted he was still the man she used to know. A few days later, Lucy sold a picture from her website. The buyer purchased an original painting and a few prints. She didn't recognize the person's name, which meant someone had found the site from her pitiful online presence and liked her work enough to buy it. It made her almost wild with excitement and she was nervous to tell anyone, at least until she'd mailed out the art. Only then did it seem real. The extra money in her bank account was a relief. It meant she wouldn't have to worry about rent this month. 2 days later she sold another painting, and then another. Then a local art shop asked about stocking her prints. She said yes at once. Earning a steady income from her art brought her a joy that was worth far more than the money itself. Although the money was very nice too. She wasn't ready to quit the coffee shop, but her shifts were less mentally draining now that it felt like she was getting somewhere with her art. Lucy finished her latest painting and started sketching out another piece, buying more paints without worrying about how expensive they were. A few weeks passed and her paintings continued to sell. Life took on a new rhythm. Lucy stopped taking extra shifts at the coffee shop so that she had more time to paint, and she got used to sending out her paintings by courier. The sudden success felt like a magical dream, filling Lucy with a sense of hope. One evening, just as she was making herself a cup of tea, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number and knew it would probably just be a telemarketer or scammer. Habit, ingrained in childhood, that a phone call must never be missed, made her answer it. Everyone was in the kitchen though, and she couldn't hear anything over everybody's chatter. Hello? She asked, turning away from roommates and heading for her room. Lou, the phone crackled so Lucy could barely hear. I'm sorry, I can't really hear. Lucy Yalkis? No good thing came from a person knowing her name. Was this the bank or the student loan company or someone telling her something had happened to her dad? That's me, I'm Lucy Yalkis, her voice not betraying her worry. Great, I've been trying to get a hold of you. My name is Rhea Turner. Lucy blinked. She knew who this woman was, had heard of her before but never imagined that they'd ever speak. I'm an agent and I wanted to know if you were interested in representation, because I'd love to work with you. I see. You've been doing your own publicity, but having an agent is useful as we can fight for you, get you into exhibits, and raise your earnings. You want to be my agent? The noise from the kitchen suddenly quieted down. Rhea laughed on the other end of the line. Yes, I do. I think you've got real potential, Lucy. Oh, yes. Yes, please. Rhea was like a whirlwind, taking over Lucy's life. Her online store was improved almost immediately, all her new paintings added and then posted to social media. One of them went viral, and suddenly her site was getting thousands of hits. For the first time in Lucy's life she had the problem of not having enough paintings to sell. Rhea told her, in no uncertain terms, that it was time to quit the coffee shop. Lucy hesitated at first, worried that all this sudden success might evaporate away, disappearing as quickly as it had arrived, but then Rhea told her she'd scheduled Lucy an exhibit in 6 months' time. She'd need a lot more paintings for that and there was no time to focus on anything else. To help with her focus, Rhea found her an apartment. The rent was astonishingly low and she'd have the place to herself. The apartment felt like another part of the fairy tale that had become her life. Wide windows looked out over the busy streets. A spacious living room made a perfect place to paint, the sun filling the room in the mornings with light. It was very different from painting in her cramped room, with her tubes of paint sprawled in a messy pile on her single bed. Just standing in her new home, sipping her coffee in the early morning light and then spending the whole day painting made her feel happy and complete. This was the life she'd aspired to, but never hoped to actually have. 2 weeks passed swiftly with Lucy producing more than ever before. One afternoon she opened the door of her apartment and found something had been left just outside her front door. It was a tiny plant in a white ceramic plant. She recognized the pattern of pale green lines in the leaves. It was a calathea plant. She stared at it, not sure what it could possibly be doing there, then she reached down and picked it up, seeing something out of the corner of her eye as she did. All along the side of the floor, pressed along the wall, were more potted plants, all of them young calathea plants. Lucy picked up the first one and went back inside. She knew who had left it there. No, she shook her head, horror slowly setting in. She didn't want it to be true. There was only one person who knew how much she liked these little plants. She thought he'd forgotten all about her, but if he hadn't, if he'd been here, leaving plants, then what else might he have done? How much of her recent success was done on her own merit, or had he been orchestrating it all? Her heart sank. Had she even sold any paintings, or had it all been him buying them up in secret? Why? Why would he have done all that? Lucy wanted to reach out and yell at him, but she didn't have his number anymore. The only thing she could do was leave a message with the reception desk. In Graffin Tower, a woman, who sounded young and nervous, answered the phone and Lucy's anger wilted away. There wasn't any point in yelling at someone who was just doing her job. Instead, she left a brief message telling Jacob to go to hell, but she doubted he would even get it. Over the next few hours, she took her anger into art. Her canvas was splashed with red, the paint going on heavy and thick. It was nearly dusk when someone knocked on her door. Paint was splattered over Lucy's clothes and her hair was a mess. She hadn't thought he'd turn up in person. Quickly, she smoothed her hand down her stained sweater and then, annoyed at herself for even caring about her appearance, she took her time answering the door. There he was, the only man she'd ever loved, the man who'd broken her heart and stolen her life. She stared at him, drinking in all the ways he'd changed. He'd aged, there were lines around his eyes that didn't used to be there and a tightness to his jaw. His suit was dark and flattering, but Lucy remembered how much he hated wearing suits. Used to hate wearing them. Jacob's expression softened as he stared back at her. It had been so long. Lucy had tried to hate him, but even now, urged to throw herself into his embrace, and the false safety of being in his arms. I wondered when you were going to show up, Lucy said bitterly. She turned away, stalked back into the apartment and threw a cloth over her half-finished painting. Behind her there was the snick of the front door being closed, and she half hoped he'd left rather than coming inside to have this confrontation. I'm not used to apologizing, he said, his familiar voice serious. But I have to tell you how sorry I am. She snorted, not able to look him in the eye. Sorry for making me think I was a good artist? That I was actually successful? That's not, he said slowly, clearly taken aback. Had he expected her to talk about the past? Lucy's scowl deepened. She didn't want to hear a word about that. That was all over now. And all that mattered was how he'd meddled in her career. He stepped closer, putting his hand on her elbow. Lucy glanced down at it, surprised by the touch. He'd always had large hands. And the sight of it reminded her of the intimacy they once had. That's not what happened. Oh, you haven't been buying my paintings? Buying my forgiveness? No. The surprise in his voice was enough to make her turn and finally meet his eyes. They were just the same shade of gray as they used to be. I haven't bought anything. I did. Give your work a little more exposure. A muscle in Lucy's jaw twitched. Artists do not compete on a level playing field. I just evened it up slightly. You deserve it. You're really good. Lucy hugged her arms to herself, dislodging his hand. She felt like such a fool. There hadn't been any really lucky coincidences here. Rhea hadn't just found an empty apartment with cheap rent. He'd arranged this too, which meant Rhea and him were in cahoots. They were the only two children on the estate. It was only natural that they would play together. But when he turned 12, he was sent away to boarding school and she only saw him when he came home for vacation. Their childhood friendship faded. The adults around them were too aware of the difference in status between them and discouraged them from spending time together. As a teenager, Lucy still felt a fondness for him. She only saw him during his school vacations and there was a distance between them now, an awkwardness. The Graffins were paying for her university fees. It was very generous of them. Truly it was a present to her father who'd worked for Mr. Graffin for over 20 years. She got into the same university as Jacob, although he was a few years older than her, so she hadn't expected to see him. It was a surprise when he walked into one of her classes. She was even more surprised when he smiled at her from across the room and came over to sit next to her. I didn't think you'd be into this, she said, with a grin, tipping her head slightly toward the whiteboard at the front of the class. The professor had scrawled French military history in large letters and was now shuffling through a pile of notes on his desk. Jacob's answering smile was warm and genuine. My interests have expanded beyond finding the best place to build a treehouse. His words startled a giggle out of her. We spent hours searching the estate for the perfect tree. Didn't we? They never had built it. Jacob's smile fell and he concentrated on setting up his laptop. No, Dad thought it was childish. Lucy nodded, remembering how her own father had taken her aside and told her that, even though Jacob Graffin was a child, his time was important and she mustn't waste it. He didn't have time for childish things and she should play with her toys and leave him alone. Well, now there was no one to tell her she was wasting Jacob's time. Hey, wanna be study buddies? I've got into study groups in other classes it's been really useful. Yeah, I'd like that. Lucy ended up studying more for that elective than any other course. The two of them had late-night library sessions multiple times a week, each session going long because of the amount of time they spent chatting. Lucy told him small details of her life, from what she planned to paint next to her favorite plant. Jacob didn't go home that winter. He spent Christmas at university, saying that he was too behind on his studies to make it back for Christmas. Lucy went home but mentioned to anyone how much time she was spending with Jacob Graffin. They shared their first kiss when they met up for their first study session of the semester. He'd pressed her against a library shelf and, when she opened her mouth to ask what he was doing, he kissed her. I've spent a long time trying to work out how to explain myself to you. You dumped me and then your parents ruined my life. There's nothing to explain. Mr. and Mrs. Graffin stopped paying her tuition fees at the end of her first year. She'd had to leave university. At the time she felt like the bottom was dropping out of her world, but leaving meant that she went to art school instead. She spent the next 4 years learning to do what she loved. It actually turned out to be a good thing. It forced her to follow her dream of being an artist. She shook her head. Just because it had turned out well for her did not mean that she had forgiven any of the Graffins. And worst of all, my dad agreed with your parents. He thinks I'm not good enough for you. That I had ideas above my station, like some stupid Victorian melodrama. A lump had formed in the back of Lucy's throat. She'd never acknowledged to herself how much it hurt that her dad had basically sided with the Graffins instead of her. Saying it out loud felt like she was exposing a wound she hadn't even known she had. Father threatened to cut me off. He was going to fire me from the company. Lucy flinched. She'd suspected his parents must have threatened him with that. Still, hearing him say it filled her with disappointment. It shouldn't though. Just because they'd been in love didn't mean he should walk away from a company worth billions of dollars. But Jacob hadn't finished speaking. They threatened your dad. They were going to fire him, stop his pension, and make sure he'd never get another job. Lucy clamped her jaw tight, feeling a chill of horror. She'd only caught glimpses of Mr. Graffin's anger before, heard his yells reverberating through the mansion, even down in the servants' quarters. She hadn't thought Mr. Graffin would go after her father like that, not after all those years of loyal service. That had been a mistake. She knew Mr. Graffin was heartless. She swallowed back a sigh of frustration. Why now? Why are you here, telling me this now? She would have given anything to hear from Jacob a few years ago. That first awful summer she kept on thinking he would reach out to her. Every time her phone made a noise she hoped it was him, letting her know that it had all been some terrible mistake. Dad is stepping down. His health is failing. I'm the new CEO. Lucy nodded. She'd seen the headline. He's pretty sick. I'm not sure how long he has left. She lowered her eyes, remembering what the old man had once been like. He'd never yelled at her, never even raised his voice. As a kid she'd loved him, despite being slightly scared of him. I'm Sorry, Lucy said quietly. It surprised her how much she meant it. Jacob stepped closer, reaching out to her, and, in a moment of weakness, she took his hand. I don't think I can forgive him for tearing us apart. But Lucy just looked away. Jacob had let himself be torn away. The old man hadn't ended things between them. She frowned, suddenly unsure of herself. Her father would have been destroyed if Mr. Graffin had fired him. Jacob's warm hand cupped her cheek, turning her head so she had to look up at him. But there's nothing standing in our way. Now, we can be together again. It's what I've been waiting for, planning for, all this time. A strange noise that Lucy couldn't control, something like a whimper and something like a sob emerged from the back of her throat. Jacob smiled, soft and radiant, seeming to take the noise as forgiveness for all the damage he'd done. He lowered his head and pressed his lips against hers. She'd always been weak to his kisses, her body falling against his as she softened. That terrible part of her that had yearned for him despite everything, refused to be repressed any longer. Her eyes closed and she gave herself over to him, clutching at his shirt as if she couldn't stand the idea they might ever be parted, that they might ever stop kissing. Her mouth opened and he deepened the kiss. It was what she truly wanted but could only admit to herself. In the dead of night, when her darkest desires played out in her head and she could imagine a world where Jacob hadn't deserted her, breaking her heart. She stilled, pulling back, the hands tangled up in his shirt flattened and pushed him back. It's always been you, Lucy. His expression was so open, a look of vulnerability that only she would ever see. It would be so easy to take him back and pretend that everything was just the same as it used to be. She could feel her resolve crumbling and she hated herself for it. Lucy shook her head, trying to clear it. She had to get him to leave before she gave in. Jacob had made her feel like she was beneath him. Her parents were servants and so she wasn't good enough, a thing to be discarded and one stupid kiss would not change that. I can't trust you. You should go. Jacob's expression shattered, a look of sorrow that lasted only a second before it was carefully tucked away. He didn't say another word, didn't try to persuade her to change her mind. It should have been a relief, but after Lucy closed the front door behind him, she slid to the floor. She didn't start crying, she was all cried out over Jacob years ago. The road trip home at the end of the school year had been fun. They had the long summer ahead of them and Lucy was too happy to worry about the way Jacob became quieter and more withdrawn the closer they got to the estate. By the time they got back to the house he was completely silent. He didn't speak at all, wouldn't hold her hand for longer than a second until Mr. Graffin's assistant told them his parents weren't home and wouldn't be back for a few days. They'd agreed to be discreet over the summer. Finding out that his parents were away felt like a reprieve, like the two of them had a few extra, stolen days to be happy together. But the assistant had been wrong. His parents were home. The two of them had been kissing when Mrs. Graffin walked in on them. The shock on her face had quickly morphed to rage. In a cold, stilted tone she'd asked Lucy to leave the room. As much as she wanted to stay, the habit of obedience was too strong. She went out to the hallway, not able to hear what Mrs. Graffin was saying to Jacob, but catching the hushed voices as she waited awkwardly in the hallway. She was on the verge of walking back in, not wanting to leave Jacob alone in there, when Mr. Graffin came down the stairs. Hello, Lucy, what are you doing here? Or, rather, why was she so far from the servants' quarters? Sorry, Mr. Graffin. I was just headed downstairs. Ah, right. That's a good girl, he said, patting her arm as he passed her and went into the library. Lucy stayed still, ready to bolt but wishing she had more courage. There was a roar. of anger, and she knew Mr. Graffin had been told about her and Jacob. Lucy shrunk back and then turned tail and ran. Obviously Mr. and Mrs. Graffin were angry, but she'd thought they would come around when they saw how happy she made Jacob. When Jacob messaged her later that night, saying he was on his way to the airport, headed to Europe for the summer, and that they were over it, was still a surprise. Next morning she was summoned to the study and told the Graffins couldn't continue to pay for her university tuition anymore. Also, she had to leave. It was not fair to the other staff that she was allowed to live on the estate when she didn't work there. An exception had been made when she was a kid, but now she was an adult, it was time for her to move out. Oh, Lucy had said meekly, so stunned she could do nothing but scan the floor, trying to find some response in the pattern of the expensive imported rug. Don't contact Jacob again, Mrs. Graffin bit out. They were the first words she'd spoken since Lucy entered the room. I won't have you getting your gold-digging claws into my son. Lucy hit the back of her head against the front door. Despite growing up on the Graffin estate, she hadn't truly understood who the Graffins were, or the depths of their cruelty. But Jacob wasn't like that. He didn't have his parents' cruelty, and she wanted to believe him about her art, or at least let him explain himself properly. She stood up, opening the door to call him back. The hallway was empty. Jacob wasn't there. Jogging down the hall and then down the stairs. She tried to catch up with him. It was too late, he was already gone. Slowly, she walked back up the stairs, feeling bereft. Rhea phoned her a few days later, wanting permission to hire a developer to redo Lucy's website. It would have been the perfect opportunity to ask if Jacob had hired her. But Lucy held her tongue, knowing that if Rhea confirmed her suspicions, then she'd feel more conflicted. Instead, Lucy focused on her paintings and setting up the exhibit. She couldn't quite lose herself in her art like she had before. It felt like something was missing. She couldn't stop thinking about Jacob. He was the only man she'd ever loved, and the sting of him deserting her had never left her. Over time it had dulled into an ache that she could push away and ignore. But there was no ignoring her feelings anymore, not now that Jacob was constantly in her thoughts. Rhea had organized a small show, a teaser for the full exhibition that was still a few months away. Lucy's heart was in her throat as she watched the gallery fill up with people there to see her work. Her eyes kept scanning the crowd, watching and waiting, unable to calm down. Until she saw the one person she was looking for. She was more excited about the prospect of seeing Jacob than the show itself, and the realization was a strange one. Somewhere, without even knowing it, she had forgiven him for leaving her. But she didn't know how to reach out to him, not after kicking him out of her apartment. It should have been an amazing evening, but without Jacob there it felt empty. The praise of the critics seemed hollow when none of them were the one person that she wanted to talk to. The show was only a few blocks from her new apartment, so Lucy walked home, her steps slow and her mind heavy. She turned the last corner and her apartment building came into sight, just as a dark car pulled up in front of her building. She stopped, far enough back that she wouldn't be seen. All evening she'd been hoping that Jacob would suddenly arrive, and now she was tired of hoping. Jacob got out of the car. The art show was still winding down, and he should have expected that she'd still be there. Was Jacob here to leave another gift outside her apartment door? She didn't want another silent gift though. Something left outside her door. She wanted him. Without another thought, she burst into a run. Up ahead, the sound of her running feet made him look up and, seeing who was there, he broke into a smile. As soon as she was close enough, Lucy launched herself into his arms, the side of his face pressed against hers, and she heard him let out a surprised laugh as he half spun them around. "This is a much better reception than I was expecting," he said, his voice gruff in her ear. She leaned back, setting her feet firmly on the ground. Their faces were close as she glanced down at his lips and then pulled her gaze quickly up to his eyes. "I've been thinking about what you said. I'm not sure I've been thinking about much else." Another man, unobtrusive and silent, got out of the front seat of Jacob's car and offered him a bag, the white plastic stretched into a weird cube shape. Tense, but somehow Lucy hadn't expected Jacob to have them too. The intrusion made her step out of their embrace, embarrassed at having been watched so closely. "I came bearing gifts," Jacob said lightly, ignoring the distance between them as he patted the bag. "I had it flown in. I thought I'd leave you a late dinner after your show." "Do you remember Nico's?" Lucy paused, a wave of nostalgia threatening to overwhelm her. Nico's was a little Greek restaurant the two of them used to go together. It was close to campus and open late. Back then they'd had a routine of studying, making love, and then, when Lucy's stomach rumbled, Jacob would insist on feeding her. Nico's had been their favorite restaurant. Both of them always ordering the same thing. "You brought me moussaka?" There was a lump in her throat. The gift wasn't the food itself, but finding out that he too had remembered the important details of their time together. "It was our favorite," he said, looking down at her, a catch in his voice that was pure yearning. She hadn't been able to stomach Greek food. After he left, the memory of Nico's spoiling her palate. "I hope you brought enough for two." He held up the bag. It looked large enough to have quite a few servings inside. "I wanted you to be eating this all week." A giggle that was far too light-hearted escaped her. There should be more to talk about, more explanations, but all of that could be done later. What mattered most was the two of them had got a second chance to be together, and she wanted to savor this moment. So she took Jacob's hand and led him upstairs to her apartment. "It smells amazing," she said, watching him as he unpacked the plastic bag, putting multiple styrofoam containers on the long kitchen counter. "I can't really believe it is true, that you're really here." She was still watching him, not moving into the kitchen as she continued, "I want to believe what you told me before, that this is real. It is. Leaving you was the worst mistake of my life. I told myself I'd done the right thing, that you would have hated me if I'd been the reason your dad was forced out of his home." Jacob looked more lost than she'd ever seen him, more vulnerable than she'd thought he was capable of. It was that look that spurred her to move closer. She reached out and took his hand. "And what happens next time? You made me feel like I was something you could just drop. Disposable. I never want to feel that way again. It won't happen again. Everything I've done, since the moment my dad gave me that ultimatum, was to get back to you. Becoming CEO means that dad has nothing to threaten me with now. There's no more leverage. He's a sick old man. There's nothing he can do to come between us anymore." He sounds so intensely earnest that, really, Lucy couldn't help believing him. She wanted to believe him, to take that leap of faith in him. She sighed, not quite able to look at him. She resented the wrinkles around his eyes and the other slight changes in him when she hadn't been around to see them form. "I want that. I want what we used to have," she said. It was a whispered confession. "I promise you we will. Not a day passed where I didn't work toward making that happen. I'm never going to let you go again," he whispered back, putting his arms around her. Standing there, surrounded by the scent of him, of the cologne he used to use, a burst of sense memory hit Lucy, transporting her back to their time together. She inhaled deeply, breathing him in as she closed her eyes. She chose to believe in their future and his promise of love. With a murmur she leaned up and kissed him. It was an innocent press of lips, just like their first kiss, all those years ago. Lucy put her hands on his chest, feeling the heat of him through his shirt, as she gave herself into the sensation of him, long missed and often thought of. His lips on hers were a gentle question that quickly became a demand for more, demand she was very happy to give into. Lucy pulled back only when she needed to breathe. His kiss had always made her feel undone. A laugh, free and easy, bubbled out of her mouth, not because anything was funny but because she couldn't keep her happiness contained. Lucy pressed another darting kiss to his lips. She didn't know how she was ever going to stop. Jacob bent slightly and, before she could work out what he was doing, he was sweeping her off her feet, holding her bridal style. She buried her head against his neck, feeling the beat of his pulse with a wild joy. She knew that everything would be okay. The hole in her heart that had never healed finally was filled. Things might not be perfect all at once, it would still take time and work. But the two of them would be together and nothing would ever keep them apart again.